Today we're talking with Parker Conrad, who founded Zenefits in 2013 and Rippling in 2016, two startups that went on to be unicorns. YC funded both. Parker's story is one of the most dramatic you'll hear on this podcast. So buckle up, because here we go. So Carolynn, today we're talking with Parker Conrad, the CEO and co-founder of Rippling. And the story of Rippling is very much intertwined with Zenefits, the company he started before that. For listeners, Zenefits handled payroll, health insurance, and employee benefits for businesses, and it grew very fast and was a big media darling. But by 2016, Parker, you'd been ousted in what was essentially a palace coup. And then the press tried to paint you as this tech villain. The press had a list of bad things they attacked you for, and they were all bullshit. Can we just dive right in and have you talk about what these things were and what really happened?
I think there were kind of three things that sort of ended up being, in the media about Zenefits. There was this thing about insurance licensing for our reps. There was this thing about the macro, and then there was the supposed party culture of the company. And there were three sort of very different things. So I can talk about them each in turn. But on the licensing side, the people at Zenefits were, for the most part, properly licensed in their home states, but they weren't licensed in other states around the country. The company was, but the individuals weren't. The simple reason is that we didn't think that they had to be. And we didn't think they had to be because that's what our lawyers had told us was required. What happened is at a certain point, our lawyers said, look, regulators are really pushing back on this. Is this really something we want to fight on? Why don't we just get everyone licensed everywhere? And we did. And sort of in the last year that I was at Zenefits, the compliance with these specific out-of-state licensing rules went over 95%. And getting your license, actually, once you have it in your underlying home state, getting your license in these other states around the country, all you have to do, you go to this website, you swipe your credit card, you pay like $75 usually, and now you have your license in the other state. And so there's no additional training required. It's really just, it's an occupational licensing requirement and a licensing fee that you need to pay. And there was like zero benefit. This is not a lot of money. There was zero benefit to the company of, not getting people licensed. Like it wasn't like a part of our business strategy. It wasn't like Zenefits' model is like, screw the occupational licensing rules around insurance license. It was just a mistake.
Because your lawyers advised you that it didn't matter.
Yeah, I think there's just a different sort of moral character to making a mistake like this than, sort of going out and, sort of like saying we're going to undermine the sort of licensing regime. While I was there, we got to this point where we were, everyone was licensed everywhere. But at the time, Zenefits was, by some measures, the largest small group insurance producer in the United States by the volume of sort of new business we were writing. And so I hired PwC to come in and basically audit all of that and sort of figure out for every deal that we had done, what was the sort of provenance of it. And then we decided, look, what we're going to do is we're going to go to regulators and we're going to say, look, mea culpa, we sort of thought the rules were one thing. We understand that you guys view them as being another. Here, like we're coming to you with sort of like an accounting of all of this, and we want to pay some fines and move on. Sort of we were preparing this. We had sort of, meetings with the board kind of every other month to go through this and go through progress on this right up until the day that I left. And on the day that my departure was announced, we had drafted this sort of, mutual press release that sort of said kind of, the same sort of anodyne things that you always say when someone leaves and, sort of mutually on both sides, like, sort of appreciation, that sort of thing. And then the company just issued a different press release and it said Zenefits had these compliance issues because this Parker guy didn't care about compliance and he's the issue, but now he's gone. And then it sort of continued from there.
Do you know now what happened between the review of that press release that everyone was like, this is the one, and then there's this period of time and then this other press release? Do you now know the sequence of events that led up to the second press release?
What I was told is that there was just always a plan to issue a different press release. That there was this sort of fake exercise with, it was this exercise with me and Kim from Andreessen Horowitz and David in the background drafting this press release that was never going to be issued.
And for the listeners, that's David Sachs.
Okay, got it.
Because they needed a scapegoat.
Why they decided to go in this direction, to this day, I don't really understand. One of my firm beliefs is that, when I left, I thought that Zenefits was going to be really successful. The company was facing just enormous commercial challenges. A lot of our growth had sort of started to evaporate. Things that were working for us top of funnel had gone away. We were missing our plan. Investors were frustrated. We were upside down on gross margins. It's my belief that in retrospect, had I stayed, I would have been able to kind of turn it around. And I thought when I was leaving that by not sort of getting into a war with the investors, I was sort of leaving, David, maybe David would figure out the sort of commercial side of this. But what happened instead is David sort of became the company's chief antagonist and was sort of going out and saying, as CEO, this company's unethical, they're, doing all these bad things. And it was really hard. The company didn't recover from that. It didn't make the company successful. It sort of buried it. And to this day, I don't really know why. I mean, I have, kind of my own theories. But one of the things, my theory on this is that David had this sort of artful way of describing the licensing issues and the compliance issues at Zenefits. And so there's this video of him at TechCrunch Disrupt. He was talking with Connie Laszlos about Zenefits. And he has this slide in a deck that he presents where he sort of had 3 bullet points. And the first bullet point was, I'm paraphrasing here, but the first bullet point was it's no secret that Zenefits has, huge compliance issues. And bullet point 2 was the culture of the sales organization is broken. And bullet point 3 was the sales organization always reported directly to Parker and not to me. And the sort of implication of that sequence of bullet points was that the compliance issues were all on the sales team. And that actually wasn't true. It was sort of an artful kind of lie. And most of the compliance violations, as it turns out, were on the account management team that reported right up to David. Look, as CEO, I'm responsible for the whole thing. So I'm accountable for, the misses in all parts of the company. It was sort of always sort of strange to me that David was attacking me for these licensing failures, 70% of which happened in, his org and while he was running it. That was a very closely guarded secret. And I was under enormous legal restrictions. And was told I wasn't allowed to talk about it. So, I would meet with regulators, and Zenefits would send their attorney to those conversations with regulators, and they would ask me why weren't people licensed in these other states? What led you to believe that was okay? And the Zenefits attorney would step in and say, well, that's attorney-client privilege communication. We object to Parker answering the question because that touches on advice that Parker got in his role as CEO of the company. And because it was advice that he was getting as CEO of Zenefits, this is a privilege, an attorney-client privilege communication that Zenefits owns the privilege on, not Parker. And so we don't want him disclosing that. And my lawyers explained to me, look, you can't disclose it. And if you do that, the company will sue you. They'll stop paying your legal bills. I had sort of an enormous number of legal bills all of a sudden and really didn't have the financial resources without the company sort of paying for it to defend myself. And so, I kind of didn't have a choice. I had to sort of, keep it, zipped. And that really kind of never came out in all of this. David emerged from Zenefits as kind of the white knight of compliance. And I'm sort of guessing at this, but I think that in David's view, there was something that would attach itself to him. I don't think that David was out there to sort of purposefully, screw up compliance either. I think it was a mistake, but I think it might have looked like, hey, hey, David, you were CEO of this company. You're a lawyer. Why weren't you on top of this? And I think he managed to sort of, extract himself from the situation without that sort of becoming a part of the narrative. And I think that's why he did what he did. So the second piece of this is the macro. And what the macro was when I was first applying to Y Combinator, I needed to build a prototype. And to do that, I needed to get my insurance license so that I could get plan data and pricing information from insurance carriers. And to get your insurance license, one of the requirements is you need to take a course. And this course is offered by, a couple different vendors, but one of them is Kaplan, and they have an online version that you can take. And when you take this online course, you sort of click through on their website these pages of content. There are a few paragraphs on each page. There are like hundreds of pages, across the course. Every few pages, there's a short quiz or exercise that you take. And at the end, you take a proctored in-person exam. And I got like a 94% on the exam. I knew my stuff. But at the end of the online course, I got to this blank page that had this timer counting down. And it said something like you have, 18 hours and however many minutes remaining. You have to stay on this page until the timer is complete. After 5 minutes, this sort of dialogue window opened up and it said, hey, it's been 5 minutes. Are you still there? You'll be logged out for inactivity. Click here to stay logged in. And so I clicked there and I sort of suddenly realized like, man, I have to stay here and keep clicking this button every 5 minutes for like the next 18 hours or
That's
whatever.
Crazy.
Because it says you must be doing this for 40 hours or whatever.
That's right. There's a minimum. It's, like 40 hours or 52 hours or something like that.
Okay.
And so I kept there like clicking that button for hours. And eventually what I did is I wrote a 3-line script. And what it did is it clicked, I'm still here. Then it waited 5 minutes. And then it was like, go to line 10 and repeat the process. And all that it did was, maintain the session and kept you logged in. What's important is what it didn't do. It didn't, it doesn't take the test for you. It doesn't give you any of the answers. It doesn't advance you through the course content. It just kept you logged in. And I thought I had sort of hit like a bug in the system. I didn't think that, anyone really intended or wanted me to sit there sort of clicking that button for 18 hours. It turns out that's exactly what they want you to do. And so that was the macro. And that ended up getting described sort of in a lot of the media reports about this as, insurance fraud and cheating on the licensing exam and stuff like that. And I think it was naive. I obviously wish I hadn't done it. But again, I think, there was no intention to sort of cheat anything. And I think that look, my view was I knew my stuff. I passed the test. I got a great score. I had sort of put in the work to sort of understand sort of how this all worked. And I, in sort of all of everything else I've done, at school and academically, skipping ahead or learning things in less time has always been something that's like celebrated and not something that you get punished for.
So just so I can clarify, any reasonable human being is not going to want to spend 20 hours hitting the refresh button for every 5 minutes so that they don't get logged out. It's just ridiculous. So I just think what you did was something any reasonable person who is capable of writing a script would have done.
People who take that test probably pay their children to keep clicking the button. I mean, it's obvious no one's really sitting there.
And so that clarifies that. You said a third thing, party culture.
The third thing is that came out about Zenefits was this party culture at the company. And what I'll tell you about this is it's just complete BS. I don't want to say there weren't issues with the culture at Zenefits. There were. And a lot of them had to do with just the overwhelming amount of work that people were taking on. And sort of there was a real burnout culture at the company. But there really wasn't, as far as I could tell, a huge party one. And look, we had beers in the office and, 8 p.m. on Friday, people would get together and have beers with their colleagues. But, it was 8 p.m. on a Friday and most people were still at work. And where this came from is there was a Wall Street Journal article. And sort of the origin of this Wall Street Journal article is that the landlord of our building at 303 2nd Street in San Francisco sent an email to our office manager that said, hey, we found a used condom in the stairwell in the sort of line that you guys are in. Can you please tell your employees that this is completely unacceptable behavior? And unfortunately, our office manager sent an email out about this to 1,600 people. And, one of whom ended up forwarding this along to the Wall Street Journal, and it became a really big story. The thing is, and that story, by the way, got written and rewritten.
Oh, yeah, that's juicy.
Sex in the stairwells of, high-flying, orgies at high-flying tech startup. And, the thing is there are 30 other companies in that building. It's not even clear that it was someone at Zenefits.
It's not even clear it was someone in the building. Let's be honest. Like, it could have been anybody.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
But that became this sort of scarlet S that was sort of came to really define the company in the media, even though I think it was really just sort of, completely inaccurate. But those were sort of the three sort of big public controversies at Zenefits.
Okay.
It was the licensing, the macro, and sex in the stairwells.
Okay, well, I'm really glad that we got to the bottom of all three of those things. Let me just also say you're not saying this, I'm saying this. Like, press, as we know, Carolyn, are eager for stories of founders misbehaving. Yeah. And, if they can latch on to anything, they'll twist it and they'll keep reusing it. And I can't tell you how many examples there are of some lie that was told about someone at YC that's just perpetuated, over and over and over. And then it appears in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and now it's a fact. With all these three things, do you think that David Sachs or the board or whoever made the decision sort of used these blown out of proportion stories as a pretext to oust you?
Zenefits had some very real problems. And the very real problems were about the business and the financials of the business. They all really stemmed from, I think, this original sin decision that I made at the company, which was in the early days of Zenefits, everything was working so well for us. I mean, I had come from a company before Zenefits where, man, we would try sort of 5 things to try and get customers. And, 4 of them would fail miserably. And one of them would mostly fail, but would work kind of just enough that, it would sort of inspire us to keep going for another 6 months and pivot the company and try and get something to work. And we kept doing that for 7 years before I left and started Zenefits.
Wow.
And then at Zenefits, it was the complete opposite. At Zenefits, it was we would try 5 things and they would all work. And we would try 2 things that we thought would never work. And those would kind of work too. And so it's this great example of just, what things look like when it's working and when the market is sort of sucking the company into the market, or the void is kind of sucking the company into the market. And so our biggest fear was that actually, there were going to be fast followers, that there were going to be other companies. We had sort of uncovered this pot of gold. And there were going to be other businesses that were going to sort of establish a toehold. And I thought that we really had to sort of suck up all of the oxygen in the room and basically say, look, we've got to soak up all the demand. We can't leave room for someone else to come in, because if we do that, it's unclear when things sort of settle out. At some large scale, we thought there were going to be network effects in the business, but it was not super clear. If someone else was willing to push the gas pedal all the way to the floor, would we even be, having discovered the market, would we be the ones that the sort of lens of the market was centered on, at the end of the day, if we weren't able to sort of grow and sort of take up, all of the oxygen in the room. And so we made this decision. The sort of insight behind Zenefits was really that, there was all of this before Zenefits. Companies tend to have multiple systems for HR and benefits. So they would have, something for payroll, something for 401k. Most of the sort of, for small businesses, most of the stuff around insurance was offline, and you handled it via the fax machine. And so you'd have to fax in an application for medical insurance, for dental insurance, for vision insurance for each employee. And so we sort of said, look, you can put the insurance pieces online, and then you can do all of this together in one place. And that just dramatically cuts down on the administrative work required for people to run the HR systems within their company. And so what we said we do is, early on, we said, look, companies have all of this administrative work. We're going to take all of that administrative work on ourselves. We're going to do it for them behind the scenes. And over time, we're going to work to automate it and work to sort of put it all in software. You kind of had to do it that way because the insurance companies didn't have good systems. You still had to interface with them via the fax machine or often manually. And so it meant that Zenefits was sort of secretly behind the scenes, this giant sort of operational machine. There were kind of 2 problems or a couple of problems that we faced with that. And one was that when you scale something up with manual ops, it's very hard. It's much harder to come back later and automate it. If you sort of start with automation, you can gradually scale out the automation over time. But the system it just kind of grows too complicated when you start with ops and it gets really big to come back. And so the automation was constantly running behind. We had these estimates on like when it was going to be fully automated, and it was constantly getting pushed out. The second problem is that whenever you're doing something manually, there's an error rate around that. And so what customers started noticing is that, in that error rate, if you're really good, it might be 99, you might be 99% accurate or even 99.9%, but you're never 100%. And customers started noticing that every once in a while, there were these sort of unexplained errors where things would go wrong in these critical areas of their business where they didn't want errors to exist at all. And the sort of conventional wisdom on Zenefits shifted from, hey, this is incredible to, well, the concept behind this is amazing, but the execution sort of leaves something to be desired. And once that happened, everything that was working for us top of funnel stopped working, and it stopped working very quickly. And it happened just a few months after we had raised this enormous amount of money at this very high valuation, having sort of promised investors that the top line revenue of the company was going to grow at these sort of really abnormally high rates. And so, the growth sort of plateaued. The burn was enormous because it's really expensive to be doing things in this way. Our gross margins weren't great because, again, it's really expensive to be doing things in this way. And investors were freaking out. This was, our lead investor was Andreessen Horowitz. It was their single largest investment ever.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
At the time, it was their single largest investment in any company.
What year was that?
This was in 2015. And so it was in that context that suddenly, these compliance issues came to the fore. And look, I mean, the compliance issues were real. I truly believe that, look, had the business been working, the company, we all would have sort of locked arms and sort of resolved these issues with regulators. And it would have been, a bad press cycle for a week or two, and then we would have moved on. And that's what I believed, even when I left, that was sort of what I believed was going to happen. That, I was going to leave the company, but we were going to sort of resolve this stuff, sort of arm in arm, even after my departure. And then it just changed overnight.
And then that's not what happened.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't get the strategy though. The strategy was going to be, let's lock arms and just go say mea culpa to the regulatory authorities, pay a fine and move on. And this was a completely different strategy. But how is the strategy they picked going to help what were the company's real problems? How does that all weave together?
I mean, it didn't. So in retrospect, what happened at the board meeting where I agreed to resign, Lars and Ben laid out, they sort of said, look, we want you to stay around. We want you to stay on the board. We want you to continue to run product at the company. We want David to step in as CEO, and we want to keep David as CEO for 6 to 12 months. And then we're going to bring you back as CEO. And I had this sort of bad experience at my previous company where I had kind of stayed around for a while, after I had been sort of demoted. And, I sort of told him, look, I'm I think clean breaks are the best thing here. So if you guys want me out, I'm out. Lars turned to me and said, well, what are you going to do? What's your kind of next step here? And I said, well, I think I'll start another company. And that was not a popular answer. And Lars sort of said, look, you don't have it in you. I don't think that there's any way you're not going to start another company. And I think that, they were worried about me competing with Zenefits or doing something. There was an enormous, over the next year, there were just enormous efforts from the company to try and get me into an enforceable non-compete agreement.
Pretty tough in California.
So non-competes are not enforceable in California, except there are some exceptions. And one exception is if they are signed in connection with a stock sale transaction. And so the effort was always to arrange some kind of stock transaction that could be paired with a non-compete that then would be enforceable. And there were, some really extreme efforts here. At one point, so first, I actually didn't intend to start another company in this space at first. And then what happened is it became clear to me that David, in my view, David was not trying to make Zenefits work. He was sort of the company's chief prosecutor in the media. He fired all the wrong people. He promoted all the wrong people. He canceled all the wrong projects. It was, and so what it looked like to me was David's, just like, sinking the company, driving it into the ground. And I didn't totally understand why. It seemed like, it was sort of to help with his personal reputation. But it seemed like, man, for whatever reason, this thing that I thought Zenefits was going to be is not going to happen. The company's going to go to zero. That was when I decided, like, okay, I'm going to start a new thing and start from zero. And I viewed it as like very much like I was going to continue what we had started at Zenefits. And I went from having, $600 million in the bank and, 1,500 employees and an existing product and, 75 million revenue to having 0, 0, and 0 and starting over from square one. But I thought, like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to rebuild a lot of this and we're going to go down the path that we would have gone down had David not come in and sort of like turn the company in a different direction. And that was really to sort of expand from this idea of, employee data, all-in-one HR systems to employee data as this primitive for business software writ large. That the idea was that for the same reason you kind of wanted to have one place to set up an employee or to onboard them across all your different HR systems, across payroll and 401k and medical insurance and dental insurance and so on and so forth. You actually kind of wanted the same thing across the entire company. You wanted that to work for IT, for getting them set up in email and Slack and Dropbox and Salesforce and GitHub, and you wanted it to work you wanted to ship out their computer and their laptop and get them set up in all of these other places as well, and sort of broadly manage employee data across the business. And that was sort of the idea behind Rippling. But at one point, when we were in YC, so when Rippling was in Y Combinator, shortly before demo day, David heard that, through the grapevine that I had started this company that was, going to compete with Zenefits, and sort of got an inkling of kind of what we were up to. There was one of the investors in our Series C round at Rippling was Insight Partners in New York. And Insight delivered a lawsuit to my lawyers. So they didn't file it, but one of the things that lawyers sometimes do is, as part of a negotiation, is they will say, look, we have written this lawsuit and we're going to, drop it on your doorstep and we're going to file it, next week unless you settle with us. And so Insight dropped this lawsuit. The company's lawyers, David's attorneys, called up my lawyers. It was like the same day or the next day or something, and said, hey, we heard you have this problem with this Insight lawsuit. And they said, we can make this go away for you, but we're not going to make the lawsuit go away if Parker is competing with us. And so what we need is Parker needs to, give us or sell us in some way a bunch of stock and sign a non-compete that is going to say that for 5 years, Parker will not start a company that does anything in B2B software.
Because it's now enforceable, the non-compete in California, because you've sold a part of this stock.
Because as long as you exchange some stock as part of it, you can make it enforceable. I said, no way. It would have, this was like literally, it was right around demo day for YC with Rippling. And so I would have had to sort of give up doing Rippling if I signed it. And sort of, it was sort of mortgaging my future. So I said no. And there was a huge fight. There ended up being enormous, personal consequences for me of that. But Insight ended up not filing the lawsuit. So it ended up, at least on the litigation side, being a bluff.
It just causes my stomach to be in knots hearing this story.
It was basically sort of a low-grade intimidation tactic to try and force signing a non-compete and do a stock sale transaction to make it enforceable. And they said, look, this is a lawsuit that, against you personally. I had a decent amount of sort of financial difficulties through this period because I had sold some secondary at Zenefits, but not so much that I was going to be able to afford a lot of legal defense. And so I had a pre-existing agreement, as most executives at companies will have, that I was indemnified, by the company for for legal defense as a result of things that came out of my role as the CEO of the business. And so through all of this, Zenefits was had to pay my legal bills. What was interesting about the sort of threatened insight litigation is Zenefits said, no, we don't have to pay your legal bills for that. That's your own personal thing. Like that's not. And so it was sort of engineered to be this thing where, hey, it would actually be, millions of dollars to defend this lawsuit that the company would say, we're not going to pay it. And so, sort of like you're kind of screwed on that front. So you can't like, even if you think that you'll win the lawsuit, which my lawyers were always very clear, like there were no grounds for the litigation. You still need to spend millions of dollars defending it. That was sort of money that I didn't really have.
Of course.
Okay, so you were being like threatened financially with this lawsuit. I believe also that Zenefits was using the press to blacken your reputation, correct? For quite some time.
For like 6 months, there were just these ongoing daily or weekly attacks. And there were reporters that reached out to me and said, look, I get pitches from the company's PR reps, every week to write an article about you. And David, like when David took over, he hired this guy, Lanny Davis, who is sort of a crisis PR person who he represented the Clintons in Whitewater. He's gone on and, represented a bunch of other folks, but he's a very, David has this philosophy about sort of, media fights that I think Lanny really sort of exemplifies. And so David, sort of explained this to me at Zenefits when we got into this sort of fight with ADP, one of our competitors. And David's view is like, look, when you get into a fight with someone, you've got to attack. And if the other guy rolls over and cries uncle, that means it's working. And you've got to keep attacking. And that was his sort of philosophy on doing this. And so that was what David kind of turned against me, once he took over as CEO. And this continued for about 6 months. And it stopped, like I'm convinced it stopped only because of YC. At the time, Sam Altman was running YC, and Sam came to me. Sam was just talking with me about what was going on, and I was sort of telling Sam about how hard all of this was. And I didn't hear anything for a few weeks, and sort of out of the blue, Sam called me and said, "Look, I've spoken with Mark Andreessen and told him that he's risking his relationship with Y Combinator if these attacks continue." And Mark went and spoke with David and told David that David was risking his relationship with A16Z if he continued. And there was apparently, a big fight about that. And sort of a couple of other people sort of like, told me that they had sort of, seen this or overheard it. And then overnight it stopped, like overnight. And there was still, there was ongoing bad press, but it was very clear that there wasn't someone driving it. There wasn't someone kind of trying to get, more stories every single week. And that's when it stopped.
Good work, Sam Altman.
Yeah.
Helping out Parker.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I can only imagine, and it's like, I wish I had been in closer touch with you at this particular moment, because you must have just been devastated at this point and beaten down and just so demoralized.
It was really hard. I was super depressed. I really kind of withdrew from, I sort of spent, sort of 6 to 9 months just kind of like hiding at home, not really seeing many people or talking with many folks. And, because it all sort of unraveled so quickly. I mean, Jessica, you say you didn't do anything, but like, YC was really, they were like YC really stood by me through all of this. And it was I think one of the incredible things about the program is there was, I was really radioactive for a while. Like people would, when we announced our Series A, people got attacked for investing in me. Like, why would you invest in this like awful person? And, supporting me was like sort of a deep sort of moral failing. And YC was like, they were the most consistent supporters. And Jessica, you were, sort of in the first round of seed investors into Rippling. So I will always be like deeply grateful for that.
Aw, well, I'm just glad now that we can kind of move on to the new part of the story and talk about rippling. What gave you the strength to be like, I'm going to do this again? Because I would have quit.
So there were two things. One is that I really wanted this product to exist. And it was just, I felt like Zenefits had sort of suddenly collapsed for all these crazy reasons that had nothing to do with the fundamental, success of the approach. And so I remember talking with Prasanna, who was my co-founder at Rippling, and Prasanna asked, why do you want to do this thing that's kind of in the same area? And I was like, look, nobody's going to build this if we don't. And there's $100 billion like lying on the floor, right on the street, right there. And like you and I are the only people that can see it. And everyone's just kind of walking by oblivious. And like all we have to do is like go over there and pick it up. Like we know, like if we build this, it's going to work. This is what people want.
Prasanna was a YC founder, right? From a different company.
He was a YC founder. He started a company called Like a Little. And then he worked with me he was an engineering director at Zenefits and then joined me to start Rippling.
I just want to take you back. You're kind of at home hiding, feeling very depressed about all that's going on. What kind of got you out of that? Was there an event? Was there a conversation? Or was it just like you just needed time and then you sort of emerged and you're like, okay, I'm ready to do something new?
It took years to sort of snap out of that. I mean, I think it wasn't that I sort of came out of that. It was that once I sort of realized that David was kind of like burying the company and it wasn't going to work, I thought, look, so one was I wanted this product to exist. But the second piece of it was that I sort of was not good at, there some of the, like David is an incredible polemicist. Like he's really, he's an incredible writer. And really good at sort of framing these kind of like attack narratives. And, you see it with some of his political stuff now. But that was like, I've never been like really good at that. And so I sort of thought, I can't win on that front. And the only way for me to sort of, and I wasn't allowed to sort of talk about the things that I'm talking about with you guys or have been talking about with you guys right here. And so I thought the only way for me to sort of talk about this, to speak in some way to like my former colleagues, to, extended, friends and family, to the tech community, to the media about these issues is to build this specific company and build it into, an enormous, $100 billion outcome. And that if I did that, that would, make a statement and it would force like a reassessment. And that was the thing that got me going. And so it wasn't that I wasn't depressed about all of this. It was that, this felt like the only path forward was to do this and to make it, sort of really successful. And that was, look, over the last 7 years, there are many other sort of, things that I love about Rippling. I love the product. I really like the people that I work with and enjoy that an enormous amount. But there was a long period of time where, that was, that was the first thing on my mind every day when I woke up in the morning and the last thing every night when I went to bed. And that was the thing that sort of got me to sort of put one foot in front of the other. There's one critical insight behind Rippling, and that is that employee data is really widely distributed across an organization. And importantly, not just inside of HR systems. And because of that, I think the right way to think about employee data is as a primitive for a lot of business software that companies use. There's sort of a problem that this situation creates for businesses that we can solve. And there's this related corollary opportunity for Rippling. And the problem that it creates is that this sort of fragmented employee data across your organization and across all these different business systems is secretly the cause of a very large percentage of the administrative work required to run a company. And you see this as a company in stark relief whenever you hire someone, because you need to set them up in all these different places. And you don't just need to set them up in HR systems. You need to set them up in every business system that your company uses. And one of the great things about Rippling that we see is we've had third parties go out and look at businesses that use Rippling and businesses that use anything other than Rippling and look at, people that the number of people that those businesses have in HR, IT, and finance. And one of the things that they found is that at every stage of growth, companies that don't use Rippling have about twice the number of people in those G&A roles in HR, IT, and finance as businesses that do use Rippling. And it's because of the sort of additional administrative burden that you have if you're using really anything other than Rippling. And it gets quite extreme at like 1,000 employees. I think it's something like 46 people for businesses that don't use Rippling versus 28 people for companies that do use Rippling.
That's amazing.
And so there's a real operational, Rippling makes your company more operationally excellent because you don't have a bunch of people doing things in this, doing a bunch of administrative work that you otherwise would have. The second sort of corollary opportunity comes from the fact that, companies that make business software, and I don't mean companies that make HR business software. I mean, all companies that make business software, they're kind of aware of this dynamic. They sort of know that if they ask you for a lot of information about your employees, it just means a lot of work to implement their software because now you've got to load all that data into their system and you've got to maintain it. Anytime you hire someone, anytime something changes, you've got to make changes in their system along with all the others. And so companies that make business software, they tend to ask for as little information about your employees as they possibly can. And that's led to this situation where business software just knows much less about your employees than it ought to know. And that has a whole set of product implications. It means that, most business software, is dramatically under-permissed because in Rippling, you can set up role-based permissions that are inherited based on someone's job or function within the organization. But in most business software, what happens is everyone has no administrative permissions at all by default. And you need to click and make someone an admin one person at a time, which means you don't do it very much. And you end up with this kind of bank teller situation in most business software where there are a very small number of admins and everyone needs to sort of wait in line for those people to kind of help them do their job. Just like the way you used to have to, if you wanted to check your account balance or make a deposit or a withdrawal, you had to wait in line for like the bank teller to do that for you. A second example of this is most business software is really weak on approvals, things like approvals, because they don't understand relationships between people within the organization. They might know who someone's manager is, but they don't know who the VP of their department is or their HR business partner or their strategic finance associate. And often you want to route approvals to people based on those types of relationships as well. And reporting is weak in most business software and analytics because a lot of the way you take transactional data and turn it into like insights about your company is you want to look at it by department, by manager. You want to zoom in on a particular work location. You want to filter out your interns, look at only people that have 2 years of tenure. And so often a lot of the sort of data stacks that people put together, what today we call like ETL and data warehouses and BI tools is really about, getting all of this data joined and transformed in a way that you can, combine it with org data to get to sort of insights about the organization. And so the opportunity for Rippling is really like, look, what if you had a different set of assumptions, like if you didn't start from the assumption that you're just not going to have access to this data about employees and about the organization, there's a lot of business software that you would build very differently. And it would be, I think, much better as products. There are a lot of product capabilities that you would have in all of these other areas if you started with employee and organizational data deeply embedded in the foundation of the product.
And is this what you refer to as a compound startup?
Yeah. And so that's when I talk about, a compound startup, that's what I mean. It's saying, look, we're going to build a whole suite of like deeply integrated and interoperable products that are all built on top of, this foundation of, at the very base layer, this just deep understanding of all of your employee data. We call it the employee graph because it's this sort of graph-based representation of not just like, employees in their department and their work location, but also data that's coming in from other parts of the product or even other third-party products and, information about, their GitHub pull requests and their the opportunities that are in their name in Salesforce, and that that sort of forms the foundation of that data layer. And then on top of that, a set of what we call middleware components or platform component capabilities that are like shared sort of capabilities across all of our products. So, things like analytics and permissions and workflow automations and approvals and a few other things that then you take as reusable Lego blocks and you use to then build sort of all as the sort of, underlying structure for a lot of different business software. Our goal at Rippling has been to launch 5 new SKUs every year. And so, we were sort of constantly seeding or nucleating new product organizations to build these new products on top of this sort of larger system. And the advantage is always that these products are, deeply understand your organization in ways that their competing standalone products don't. We tend to invest really deeply on these sort of fundamental components of business software, analytics and permissions and approvals and workflows and things like that. And so they tend to win on those things because competitors will kind of build those things as sort of afterthoughts. But because we're building them across all these products, we can invest much more deeply. And everything's all in one system with one UX and sort of, sort of much easier to use for that reason as well.
Well, I'm glad you brought up competitors because going back, that was one of the driving concerns at Zenefits, right? You were talking about how, you guys really wanted to make sure you were the ones and that you banished all competitors along the way. Different mindset probably for Rippling, or maybe not. Like, you tell me, how do you think about competitors now?
Yeah, Rippling competes with a ton of different companies. I think the mistake that we really made at Zenefits is I think, we did this thing, to sort of grab market share very early on, which was not scalable. And I think that was okay for, at first. I mean, YC's mantra is like, one of YC's sort of pieces of advice is do things that don't scale. And I think that's absolutely right early on. But the sort of counterpoint to it is like, eventually you need to scale them. And we really didn't. That was the problem. And so the issue, I think the real sort of mistake at Zenefits was doing all of this manually, and we should have, maybe we should have done that during YC, but then we should have really focused on automating that before we started growing again. And that was the thing. We did that very differently at Rippling. And so at Rippling, it took us a long time to launch. I mean, we had, for 2 years, the company was like 50 engineers and me and a few other people, but mostly engineering. And we sort of built this thing end to end, but all in software. There were no operations of any kind inside the company for a long time. And actually, until we were at like 5 million in ARR, we didn't have anyone in support in the company. And so, I did a lot of the customer support. The engineering team did a lot of customer support for their specific products. And it was only, once we got to some really large scale that we started bringing in a support team, but it sort of forced us to kind of just drive down all of the operations work inside the business.
When did you get an HR team?
We hired an HR team reasonably late inside. I mean, when I'm talking about operations, I meant more like customer operations. So it was like, things to get people enrolled in insurance and so we were trying to make sure that everything ran on software rather than people for customers. But actually, one of the things that's still true about Rippling is that I'm the only full admin for Rippling in Rippling.
This is going to be my question. I wanted to confirm if you are the HR administrator for Rippling.
Well, that's where I was going with my question too.
So to be clear, we also have a great HR team that does, helps with other types of things. And obviously it's very important, from, things like compliance and, making sure that things don't go off the rails, that you have like really good, strong in-house HR. So we have a great HR team, but in terms of like a lot of the administrative work around HR, that's something that I handle personally. So I run payroll for Rippling has 2,000 employees across a dozen countries, and I run payroll for everyone. I, manage employee benefits, manage a lot of sort of IT, app provisioning rules, things like that. I, approve, every expense above $10 in the company, because we have an expense management software. And so
that's amazing.
A lot of why I think the product works so well for customers and why you see that customers are able to, have so many fewer people in these functions is because we spend a lot of time working to sort of make it possible for me to keep doing that. And that forces you to kind of constantly automate more and drive down the level of administrative work. And that then sort of, there are benefits that accrue to all of our customers from those investments.
And for any founders out there who are listening, I need to point out that we get really excited when we hear of founders who are eating their own dog food.
It's a huge advantage because look, I promise you, we have payroll competitors that don't use their own system for payroll. SMB payroll systems that run on Workday, because they can't use their own system. And I know the CEOs of ADP and Paylocity and Paycom and UKG, and they don't run payroll for their companies. And so I think that doing that, it gives me I think it gives me a right to an opinion about the product. It like a lot of, one of, I think, the great pieces of advice that YC always has for founders is to talk to customers. And that's great advice, but another way to kind of do that is to really be the customer yourself. And then you can have, those conversations in your own head, and they're often like much higher fidelity and can happen much more quickly.
You're your own user.
Yeah.
I love it. Can I go back quickly to this sort of kind of modular structure where where you try to launch the new products and stuff? I've also heard that you hire a huge number of founders to sort of run those business units. Is that on purpose that you've done this, or has it just worked out that way?
What Rippling is doing when we're building all these different products in parallel, it's very much counter to the conventional wisdom on how you're supposed to do this. Because the way you're supposed to do this is to focus on one extremely narrow thing and go deep on that. And I happen to think that advice is wrong, or at least limiting. And that I think that the way that we've built business software over the last 20 years is mostly incorrect. And it's been to build a lot of these sort of narrow point solution products that inhabit these sort of local minima from a client perspective. But actually, like, the global minima is to take this compound approach and have, one system that kind of does a whole bunch of things for companies. That the way we build software today, and this is not my idea, I'm stealing this from someone else, but it's kind of like if you bought a car, and instead of buying a car, you bought a steering wheel from one company and a chassis from another, and a carburetor from a third, and you sort of brought it home and sort of tied it all together with Scotch tape and glue. And then of course, like when you're driving down the road, you'd have like parts like falling off, and like it wouldn't work very well. The right way to do this, or the sort of global minima, the ultimate product for customers, is to do this sort of, to do all in one, and not just all in one, but allest and oneist. And so that's the approach at Rippling. One of the things, so we knew when we were starting Rippling that this was unconventional. And so we were always, we thought, like, look, this compound approach was both something that could become like our biggest enduring advantage, but was also like, if the company doesn't work, why will it not work? And it was like, because it's like really hard to do this, and there are a bunch of reasons why this is not supposed to work. And so a lot of, our focus at the company has actually been on making this particular approach to building software work, and finding all of the different places where it breaks down, and then finding solutions for each of those things. And there are a bunch of places where it breaks down, or places where we've had to find sort of like really clever solutions. But one of the things that you absolutely need is you need to be able to sort of create these small teams that are individually very focused, and sort of can sort of run quickly to sort of build products within Rippling. And the best profile of person for doing that are people that have had this experience of starting a company. And so we hire a lot of former founders. I think the last time we looked at this, it was like a year or two ago, and I think we had something like 50 people that had started companies at Rippling, including
wow,
including a whole bunch of former YC founders. that work at Rippling and in a variety of different roles, but many of them have started and are leading individual products and sort of business lines within Rippling.
I love that. That makes me so happy. Speaking of which, you know how you were saying you have this sort of underlying system that has all the employee data and sort of seamlessly just works amongst all these different business units. Because that underlying operating system or technology, if you will, is so robust, will that make it easier to sort of introduce AI into different things if you want to do that? Are there any plans for that?
My take on AI is, first, I'm really skeptical of companies that sort of issue press releases announcing that they're now an AI company. So one of the things that one of my goals is to never do that. And I also think that
that's funny.
I think that when people incorporate, Chat GPT into their products, I think they're actually incorporating the wrong part of it. They're sort of copying the chat interface. And I think the chat interface is a bug and not a feature. And that nobody actually wants to chat with their payroll software or their expense management software. But there are a bunch of ways that you can incorporate or that you should incorporate sort of some of the ability to work with unstructured data and the capabilities that brings into your product. And so I guess my sort of thesis about Rippling and AI, and we're sort of very early in kind of doing this, is that a lot of the B2B AI use cases will end up requiring a deep understanding of your organization and your company. Almost any time that you want to sort of do something AI related with employees, and again, that's not just an HR software. It might could be in any sort of vertical, B2B software vertical. It kind of matters. You need to understand, is this person a junior IC employee, or are they the VP of a department? Are they in engineering or in customer support? Are they in San Francisco or in Bangalore? Are they an intern, a contractor, or a W-2 employee? What teams are they on? What sort of all of that context about their job and role and function and their relationships to other employees within the organization is a really important input for almost anything that you might want to do from an AI perspective in a B2B software context. And so that when we think about AI, it's always about sort of what are the types of applications that require this sort of deep contextual understanding of your company. And that's sort of those are sort of the areas that I expect that we'll focus on.
Okay. We won't hold you to anything specific. How was Y Combinator different? How was your experience different between the winter 2013 session and 2017 that you went through it twice?
Yeah. So the first time I did Y Combinator, it was the 3 most productive months of my life. It was an incredibly, incredibly intense experience. And I think it was intense both because the YC program is designed to do that. It's very effective at doing that. And I think the real value of the program, which I only came to understand once I was doing it, is that YC is just great at sort of creating a whole bunch of urgency inside of your company right from day one. And the challenging thing, one of the challenging things I've always found about starting a company is it feels superficially like being unemployed. You're kind of sitting around on your couch, screwing around on the internet. And if you don't get anything done on any particular day, nothing happens. Nobody gets mad at you. You don't have customers that are yelling at you. And so it's really hard to get in this groove of just moving quickly. But that's absolutely critical for making the company successful. And I think YC with having this cadence of dinners where, it's sort of once a week, but not 5 days a week, it's just precisely tuned to sort of create a lot of urgency, and you sort of look around, it feels like everyone else is accomplishing something, and it creates a lot of pressure for you to do the same. That is what has always been so powerful about YC for me. And that was very true for us the first time around. There were a few things I think made it really different the first time around. So one was, I just remember PG's like opening talk to the batch. And it was really incredible. And I had come off of this sort of 7 years of working at another company where things were not working. And, PG at one point sort of said, look, there were many, many really great lines in this talk. And I don't remember all of them, but I remember he sort of said, look, there are 2 or 3 of you in this room that have what it takes to be really successful founders. And, the rest of you probably don't. Like, that's okay. Like, there are other things that you can do. But I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I hope it's me. And then one of the other things that really sort of dialed it up a notch for us is that there was another company in our batch that was doing the same thing that we were doing, called Simply Insured. And they started in a slightly different area and then pivoted, and we were kind of doing things.
I think they pivoted into it.
And I remember, so for us, it was just the level of urgency was just extra high, because we would see them like talking to someone at dinner, and it was like, they're talking to our customers. And the reality is every company, like, your competitors are out there, but you often you don't have to confront that in quite as viscerally a way as we did in Y Combinator in that sort of first go round. The third thing is, I remember having office hours with PG. And I joined, I joined Y Combinator as a solo founder. And then Lux, my co-founder at Zenefits, joined a few weeks later. And, I had built like the barest outlines of a prototype. We were so far from having like a real working product. And I remember meeting with PG early on and saying, look, and obviously YC had said, you got to launch early, you got to, start selling to customers, you got to do all this before demo day. And so I said, okay, I mapped this out. And we think if we really push, we can get a product live, by like March 15th, and that'll give us 2 weeks to sell before demo day. And PG looked at us and said, you can't do that. You got to launch by the first week of February, no matter what. That's just not enough time. I said, well, there's just no way. Like, there's no way, it's already like, the second week of January, like, we can't build this thing in 3 weeks. It's not possible. And he kind of looked at us and said, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you might as well give up and like go home, because like your company's not going to work if you can't get this live by the first week of February. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I've already failed. Like, what are we going to do? And so Lux and I, we focused on this, and we figured out this way, and like, and we just really pushed ourselves and figured out a way. And we ended up launching like, not the first week of February, but the second week of February. And it actually made a really big difference, because we launched, and TechCrunch wrote an article about us that said, hey, a company doing this interesting thing, like doing insurance online, and, all this sort of interesting stuff, innovative stuff. And then Simply Insured launched like 2 weeks later. And there was an article about them that was like, weird, there's this company like copying Zenefits, like, where did they come from? And so it actually made a really big difference to the company, and was absolutely the right advice. And I think like the second time around, like YC was still a great program. It was not as intense for me personally. And I think in part because I had done it before. And so I was doing it, I wanted to recapture that same intensity. Like, that was why I did it the second time around. I thought it was really important to go back and, be right back at square one. But it was not like totally the same. I think in part because I had done it before, in part because there was no Simply Insured in the batch, quite frankly. And so it was not, and then also because, I think PG as much as like, the partners there are great, it was not the same without you guys there, without PG there.
Aww.
And so I actually
tell them that.
I remember there was this like moment in office hours, or in the sort of, small batch meetings, where there was a company that was building a sort of assistant, like an AI assistant built into sort of Android. And one of the partners sort of asked them, how long do you think it'll take for you guys to get something live that will be, really useful for just one person? And the founders sort of thought about it, and they said, I think if we really push, we can get something live that's useful for one person by demo day. And I thought like they're going to get it. Like, I could just wait to see what happened. But then the partner sort of said like, okay, that's great. and then sort of moved on. I was like, oh, like it's a little bit different. I mean, I look, I get that there's a balance between, sort of how much sort of urgency and anxiety like people can absorb about this stuff, and there's probably a balance there. But I remember thinking like, it's not like totally the same as it was before.
Also, maybe different because group dynamic versus one-on-one. I mean, it sounds like when PG was cracking the whip on you, it was just you and he and your co-founder probably. But
yeah, it's
in
harder.
A group office hour dynamic, I think maybe you.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a gentler.
It was definitely
approach,
it felt a little kinder and gentler, which is they're both good things about that, and some maybe something that you miss.
Hang on now, though. Now I've just realized something. So you're going through YC the second time, demo day. Did you raise money after demo day, or was it sort of before? Or what was the timing of when you raised the money? And wasn't there some attempt to kibosh the round?
So we raised a pretty decent seed round earlier on in the program, and there were a couple of reasons why we did that. Among them, quite frankly, is like one of the big ones was just there was so much, like while I was going through YC with Rippling, there was a lot that was still happening with Zenefits.
Okay.
And so quite frankly, we wanted to just show that like there were still, investors that supported me. And so one of our investors said there's one reason to invest in Rippling and there's one reason not to invest in Rippling. And they're both the same reason. The reason being my involvement with the company. And
Right.
And so there were always a lot of investors that came out on sort of, there were people that came out on both sides of that dynamic, but there were always enough that, believed in me and believed in the business that they invested, that we were always like, did great. But when we did our Series A, we ended up with a ton of term sheets, and Mamoon from Kleiner Perkins ended up leading the round. But it was a controversial round, and there were a bunch of investors that backed out. I had a general partner meeting scheduled with Benchmark, and the GP that I was working with there called me up on a Sunday night and said, I'm sorry, but so the general partner meeting but for the listeners who might not know what that is, it's sort of the penultimate step in a fundraising process where you meet with the full partnership, and if it goes well, you might get a term sheet after that. And so and they usually happen on Mondays. And so on Sunday night, the Benchmark GP called me up and said, look, I'm sorry, but Bill Gurley is poker buddies with David Sachs, and just, had a conversation with him. And so we have to cancel the GP meeting. And, same thing happened. Something similar happened with Greylock. Even Mamoon at KP had a run-in with David. After we signed a term sheet, David sort of found out about it, got, really upset, and had sort of a very, sort of a huge confrontation with him about it. So there was this sort of behind the scenes effort to kind of derail the fundraising. And then I think after the Series A, that sort of mostly went away. It sort of stopped from there. Look, we're not curing cancer at Rippling. And so, I don't want to sort of like, I think it's a mistake to look, sort of, be too sort of like, oh my God, change, every tech company is like changing the world in some way. But I think we have a lot of customers that are doing that. I think, look, Anderl's one of our biggest clients, and they, I think they're like doing great things for, the United States and for sort of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And that's a really important company. Look, we're very small, sort of part of everything that they're doing. But, to the extent that there are a lot of companies out there that can focus a little bit more on, their own products and what they do. And, if we can make that a little bit easier and a little more efficient, I think that's really cool.
Well, Carolyn, let me ask you, do you have questions? Because your mind must be racing since you were a lawyer.
I have a ton of questions, but actually I want to ask one completely unrelated to anything legal. So you are Parker, literally the textbook example of formidability for YC. And when I say literally, I mean, like, we used to record interviews. I don't know if anyone at YC has ever told you this, but we actually rewatched your video a whole bunch of times because we're like, this guy's so formidable. Like, can we find clues in the way he answers questions that tipped us off that, like, he's so formidable. Anyway, that was a long time ago, so I don't actually remember any of the specific, takeaways. But I guess I'd ask you, when you think about yourself, even like as a kid, as a teenager, whatever, were you always like this? Like, what makes you so formidable? Like, in other words, character, circumstance, combination of both. What do you think?
That's interesting. I mean, so I think I've had a lot of like really big ups and downs in my life. There are a lot of things that have been great for me. I mean, like I had, wonderful parents. Like I was, they were fairly well off, and my dad is a corporate lawyer in New York, and a lot of people have a lot of hardship, in that area that I've never had. But I also, I had a really hard time in middle school. Was just, sort of bad situation, like really sort of bullied and picked on, and that I think has ended up being kind of like really defining for me, like psychologically. But then also, I in college, I spent all my time working on the newspaper, which was a lot of fun. For me, I think it ended up being kind of like running a startup. You're sort of running this organization.
The Harvard Crimson, right?
Harvard Crimson, yeah.
Yeah.
I was managing editor of the Harvard Crimson, but I spent so much time doing that I failed out of school and had to take a year off. And that was just like really hard. And
just like, by the way, YC's co-founder, Robert Morris. You're not alone. A lot of great people had failed out,
exactly.
and had to take a year off.
Yeah, that's why I was laughing. I didn't
Sorry
mean
to laugh at your pain.
I was just like, oh, that's
it's
familiar story.
I think in tech, there are for a lot of people, it's sort of like, badge of honor, like tech, college dropout. But it didn't feel that way to me. It felt like just like a deep and miserable failure at the time. Very humiliating and embarrassing. Then same thing with my first company. I ended up. Look, I mean, it was a hard, slow grind. It was, 7 years of just ongoing failure. And I think when that happens, different people react in different ways. But I think for my co-founder and I, it was kind of like, I sort of, I haven't experienced this, so I don't know, but I sort of think of it as kind of like what it would be like to be, in a marriage and, a child dies, that just the other person constantly reminds you of everything that's going wrong. And it led to a lot of, interpersonal conflict, and it really ended, I think, like the friendship that I had with him, but also resulted ultimately in me being sort of fired from the company, and similar type of thing. Like I thought when I left, I thought I would never be able to do something. Like I thought my first company was going to go on to incredible success, and I was not going to be a part of it. It was this incredibly depressing thing. And so I think, there have just been like a lot of sort of really big ups and really big downs. I don't, like, sometimes people would say like, you learn so much from your failures. And I don't think I've learned a lot from failure except for, how much it sucks and how much you really want to avoid it. And so I wouldn't advise it for anyone. I think it's like, very, very destructive. But I do think that, if, like, I don't know if I would describe, I mean, I'm like flattered that YC thinks that I'm formidable, but like, I think that like to the extent that there's like, like a certain kind of tenacity, maybe that, I think that's probably where it comes from.
And we're so proud of you. I mean, you're doing so well, and there's so many things that aspiring founders could learn from you. We're so glad, you're part of the YC community. And I know you recently came back to talk to one of the first back in-person dinners that they've done at YC, and that it was off the charts. That's amazing. Awesome. John Levy, aka Jay Levy, Carolyn's husband, was just raving about it, saying it was one of the best talks he ever heard. So thank you for being an important part of our community.
It's true.
Thank you for opening up today. I mean, I think it was a really fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, Talk to you soon.
Thanks for coming,
Cool.
Parker.
Bye.
Bye.